The AFC playoff picture and how to use it to your advantage to win big dollars in the playoff challenge. That is what we were talking about today on RotoViz Overtime. We did do a show earlier this week where we talked through the NFC. We were getting to a point where we were starting to want to nearly build out the lineup, so we decided we better jump over, talk AFC, and pair all that together. The FFPC Playoff Challenge is a contest where you can pick your lineup before lock off this week's playoff games. There's going to be 14 teams in the playoffs. You pick 12 players. You let it ride through the Super Bowl. Double points for whatever players remain in the Super Bowl. There is no draft. It's just one player per team. That's how you set it up. And you have your chance then to head on and win some of the grand prizes. They do have a $35 entry. They do have a $200 entry version with the same rules and same format. So check all that out over at myffpc.com. It's one quarterback, two running backs, two wide receivers, one tight end, four flex, a kicker, and a defense. And it's tight end premium with PPR scoring. So Shawn, as we were closing out that last one, we were diving into maybe some of the upsets and how to kind of play those players, which kind of fades you might start to factor in. You mentioned playing a kicker or defense on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I may have missed it. You mentioned fading the Carolina Panthers. Was there another team then in the AFC that you were hard fading also along with the Panthers?
Well, the Steelers sort of have to be that team where you don't like their chances to win and you don't love their offensive weapons. And yet at the same time, Jaylen Warren especially, but then also Kenneth Gainwell. I mean, those guys can play. And when the Steelers really relied on Warren in the second half of that game, now they had to use Aaron Rodgers' arm at the end. And that part was fun, right? I really thought we got some vintage Aaron Rodgers throws. I had mentioned that Matthew Stafford has not been as dynamic recently. A little bit of that, probably the loss of Devontae Adams. Having said that, I do want to mention that there was some flair to Matthew Stafford in Week 18. Some of these sort of sidearm slingshot.
Locking up that MVP award, Shawn. He had to. Got to get those throws on film.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we're going to judge it on that and not who was the best player on the best team. The MVP stuff. I
love firing you up.
It's driving me out of my mind. But Aaron Rodgers, right? The release against the Ravens, the competitiveness, the release. Everyone on the show knows that I'm not a big Aaron Rodgers fan, but I am a big proponent of giving people credit for the things that they do well, and certainly not allowing your biases to swamp just the evidence of our eyes as it happens. And it was really cool to watch him in the second half against the Ravens. Really cool to see the Steelers storm back from the horrific play call from Arthur Smith at the end of the first half that costs them a touchdown. Oh, yeah. You have to have Jaylen Warren in on that play. You absolutely have to. Jaylen Warren, one of the best big running backs in the entire NFL, has to be in on that play. The Steelers win anyway. Colm, at home, but facing the Houston Texans defense. Now, the Houston Texans are another team where if you think that the Steelers can mount a reasonable attack in this game, that they'll put together a reasonable game plan, this game could be very close. It could be decided by fluky bounces. The Steelers could win. And there's a case to be made that Jaylen Warren and maybe even Kenneth Gainwell are just as strong of plays as Nico Collins on the Texans side, right? Is that the way that you're seeing this game, or do you have the Texans as just a clear-cut favorite, and not only a favorite for this game, but a team that could do some damage later on in the AFC playoffs?
I find when I was watching Week 18, I was kind of coming up with some storylines in my head of what has happened in the last couple of weeks and how the season has played out. One of those was, the Packers and how they just decided the rest of the season didn't matter. The other one was like the Rams and how things tailed off. Not tailed off, but went from, the 1 seed to the 5th seed. It's not that big of a drop because of the division standings and so on, but then you get the Panthers sneaking their way in. But on the AFC, the Jaguars and the Houston Texans development over the season are kind of two of the things that really stand out as maybe not a surprise, but where my perception was at the midseason point to where it is now and how much they've gone. Like the Texans started off 0-3, then they got to 2-3, but then they end up there at 3-5 when you get like through the 8 weeks of the season. But they come back then, and since that, they have won every single game that was left the rest of the way in the season. And sometimes we're talking about these games where teams are kind of beating up on teams, and maybe they have had some of that with, the Raiders and the Cardinals, and in recent weeks they've beaten the Titans, but they have beaten the Jaguars, they've beaten the Buffalo Bills, they beat the Colts, beat the Chiefs, and then beat the Colts this week, obviously without a number of their potential starting quarterbacks, and they beat the Chargers in week 17 as well. So they have kind of put in that caliber of opponent where they've gone and beaten them, and I've been very impressed. You kind of had the high of the rookie season of CJ Stroud, then last year, the disappointment. This year, it doesn't start off all that hot, but they have really rounded into a well-balanced roster and offense. And I do agree with you in terms of how you would think about playing some of the Steelers. And it would be very much, for me, focused around the running backs and going in that direction. That would also play into the potential of if the Texans get a lead and they're trying to build up the Packers. Aaron Rodgers on my mind here. We have the Steelers, a lot of stuff behind the line of scrimmage or just at the line of scrimmage would, for the running backs would probably become pretty favorable game script wise, even if they were eliminated. So I do think it's a case here that the Texans will win this game. But I do notice as we go through this, lean into a lot of road teams. And the other part of when we're trying to predict some of these, we're going to have some games where, there's a bounce of the ball and fumbles and things like that change the direction and the trajectory of them dramatically. This is a game where I still don't fully believe in Houston, but I kind of have some fear for Aaron Rodgers and what this Houston defense could do to this Pittsburgh Steelers offense in terms of completely shutting it down. The Houston defense has been, one of the most fearsome, hard-hitting units in the NFL over the last couple of seasons. So I'm leaning to Houston here, and I'm pretty confident in the outcome of this one. It sounds like that's the way you're leaning as well.
Yeah, I had the Texans ranked extremely high.
You've been high on them for like over a month at this point. I was like kind of getting on the train then at that point.
Yeah, you look at the different victories that they've had. You look at the fact that, as you mentioned, they are 12-2 over their last 14. They've won 9 in a row. The team they defeated on the road in week 17, that kind of hidden game because it happened not on Christmas and not on the Sunday, where they go and defeat the Chargers, who still had a lot to play for at that point. That's another big victory for them. The Texans, I think, are probably in that group with, I really think that there's an argument to be made that the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Houston Texans are the two best teams in the AFC, and that you actually have a tier down to the Denver Broncos and the New England Patriots. The fact that the Texans have not been able to unlock or not been able to continue to use Nico Collins in such a dynamic way is the big red flag. One of the things I wrote about a couple of weeks ago, and then nothing about that has changed. Certainly Collins didn't score in week 17, held out in week 18. His performance has cratered really in all facets. The ability before the target to generate targets, the ability at the catch point, and then the ability with the ball in his hands. His yards per route numbers are off in dramatic fashion, and off to the point where one thing won't explain it, right? He has been a just shadow of himself in every portion of what it means to be a wide receiver. Now, they have some depth. They have an interesting player in Xavier Hutchinson. They have a rising rookie in Jaden Higgins. He's a guy that you and I strongly believe if he were a little bit more involved, you'd have a better version of this Texans team. They've got some underneath guys in Christian Kirk and Jalen Noel. They have a vaguely competent running back in Woody Marks, although...
you want to know what they have, Shawn? They have an offense that Matt LaFleur is trying to have in the Green Bay Packers, but it's working more efficiently for them. They have a number of pieces that they're trying to use to get the most out of the offense, where other teams then can't completely game plan to be like, we'll take away Nico Collins, but then you're getting caught by somebody else. I think there's a lot of similarities in this Houston offense and the Packers offense.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that you're right. And the difference is simply that while the Packers have a good defense, the Texans have one of these defenses like we talked about in the previous show with the Vikings and the Seahawks, where they change everything for you. They're so disruptive. They're so scary. And yet, I mean, this is a team, even as we talk about them very favorably, needed some good luck to defeat the Raiders 3 weeks ago. This is a team that during that stretch of victories, they really struggled to score, right? They have the game this week against the Colts, the week 18 games in a lot of ways we can probably throw out, but they have a 16-13 win against the Titans. You don't score well in that game. A 23-19 win against the Bills. You don't score well in that game. A 2016 win against the Colts, a 2010 win against the Chiefs. You have the 40-20 victory against the Cardinals. The Cardinals, setting defensive mark. The Cardinals look like they're playing 7 guys on defense, not like 8 or 9 or 10. I mean, the Cardinals defense isn't barely there. It is entirely non-existent. Then they go right back and they score 23 points against the Raiders, 20 points against the Chargers. You are relying on your defense to carry you not most of the way there, but virtually all of the way there. When you're talking about this Houston Texans team, that will probably be enough against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Yeah. And yet it still is problematic when you think about where you're going to go. Where you're going to go off of that, if the rest of the seeds hold, would be to play the Denver Broncos. And the Broncos, another one of these teams that has not been able to do the things offensively that you want to see from them. They've had some moments, but they've also had these games, especially the last couple of weeks, where they're playing for the number 1 seed, where they really struggle to move the ball against a Chiefs team that's basically tanking. And then they struggle to move the ball against a Chargers team that's playing backups on offense. And I mean, could you win a low-scoring game against the Broncos? You absolutely could. And then suddenly you're in the AFC Championship game. It's frustrating, I think, that we don't have complete teams on the AFC side to where you would just definitively say, okay, the Texans can't win with this style of offense.
The big pivot point then, I think, Shawn, is going to become who is the quarterback across the entire contest that you want. Now, we talked through the NFC, and it didn't feel like at any point we were like, yeah, this is the quarterback. You did mention Purdy. I kind of mentioned if the Rams make a run, maybe people will want to have Stafford in there. But you get the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Buffalo Bills. Josh Allen in this contest historically has been, very favored by the players and who you want to have as your quarterback based on the scoring upside that he has. You mentioned that the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Houston Texans might be the 2 best teams in this conference. Well, that means that the Buffalo Bills are heading to the number 3 seed Jacksonville. And this is a case, again, I think, where the best player probably in this matchup is Josh Allen. But you have the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are a much more complete team, I think, than what we have in Buffalo. We've gone through quite a bit in terms of how the organization has kind of failed to put the pieces around Josh Allen. But is Josh Allen being the best player in this contest enough to get them over the line against the Jacksonville Jaguars? And then second question, if you do think that that is not enough, is James Cook the only real option that you want to roster for Buffalo in this contest?
Colm, could this be a situation where we soft fade the Bills? Would you ever
I think
feel
if you soft fade the Bills like that, you probably can get very heavy on the key names and the other lineups, because I don't think that'll be a popular move. But I think that if they're not going to make a run to the Super Bowl, having Josh Allen as a quarterback maybe it becomes much, much less favorable. And then I do think that outside of him, the clear secondary option for Buffalo is going to be James Cook.
And so you look at this game, the Jaguars' rush defense doesn't face a lot of rushing attempts, in part because over the last 6 weeks, they have really controlled games on both sides of the ball. And yet they are exploitable there. They play relatively light fronts. They give up explosive runs at a relatively high rate. I mean, that's perfect for what Buffalo wants to do offensively. And I mean, it's unfortunate for the Bills and Bills fans that that's what they want to do offensively, because you would like to see this as a team where Josh Allen can be so transcendent that the fear factor with playing Buffalo is through the roof. You think about all of these previous playoff contests, and it was always the question of, how are you possibly going to stop Josh Allen? The Bills are going to score in the 30s. The only way that you could eliminate him from the playoffs would be to have the ball last and score while he's on the sidelines. And teams have been able to do that, right? They've gotten bad luck. That's the only way to explain what's happened here. There certainly wasn't a meaningful gap between them and the Chiefs. There weren't meaningful gaps between them and other teams that eliminated them during this stretch. They got unlucky. They also had Sean McDermott as the head coach, wasn't able to fulfill his side of it by building a good defense or executing appropriate late game tactics. Well, they're right back into the playoffs here, and with a weaker team that now isn't really built around Josh Allen. The flip side of that is that he's still the guy who scores, right? So you think about his overall scoring numbers this season. They're hurt by the presence of 5 pretty bad games. That is also sort of an unusual thing for a Josh Allen, right? You have the 13-point game in week 2. You have the 10-point game in week 12 against the Texans. You have the game a couple weeks ago against the Cleveland Browns, where he torches all the people who are relying on him in different fantasy playoff contests. But he also has a 43-point game this season, a 46-point game this season, a third game with 40 points, a bunch of games over 25. And if he strings those together in the playoffs, then, I mean, he's kind of the guy where if he gets hot, you would have to have him. You think about almost all of the other teams in the mix here, and probably the only other guy that you're looking at and saying, okay, he could get so hot that we had to have him, really is probably a Brock Purdy if the 49ers go on a run, or is a Drake May if the New England Patriots kind of get out of their minor league version of football, get into the playoffs, and are still good, right? And with how well Drake May has thrown the ball, you certainly are going to be a little bit hard-pressed to bet against that. But it's Josh Allen and a few other people. I guess I still prefer Trevor Lawrence on the Jaguars side of this. We don't want to overstate and chase what he did in the fantasy playoffs that just occurred. And yet, when you think about the Jaguars as the hottest team in football, probably the best team in football, along with the Seattle Seahawks today, as we're sitting here and talking, it would be tough to move off of a Trevor Lawrence who is scoring so many rushing touchdowns, who is probably going to be a bit diverse in terms of who he's targeting. Obviously, Parker Washington has been hot. You have Jacoby Myers. You have Brian Thomas. You have Travis Etienne, who especially in a loss would be a bit of an interesting play, right? You could have a game where he completely thrashes this poor Bills run defense, and yet the Bills win in a shootout. And then you're thinking, okay, having the right guy in a first round loss is incredibly important in this contest. That's really the thing. You asked me, what are the things that you learn as you go through and play this over a number of seasons? What are the things that really stand out? Having the right guy in a first round shootout loss more or less determines whether or not you finish high in the contest, and if you are still live, obviously, as you go on beyond the wild card week.
Yeah, it's like, if you have somebody who other people then can't kind of make up those points, it's very advantageous. When, Shawn, you look through that, I agree with everything you said on the Jacksonville side, and it becomes a case, do you think they're kind of making the run and going with the quarterback, or do you think they're not? Like, you could have a situation where Etienne, say he gets a short rushing touchdown, gets a goal line carry, then he has a long touchdown, he gets some receptions. Like, he could have a big game and a win, but then they could lose in the follow-up game, and he could still have a big game based on maybe game script or how that all plays out for them. So I do think that out of the non-Trevor Lawrence options, he's definitely the most intriguing for me. Obviously, you have Brian Thomas, Jacoby Myers, Parker Washington, who you referenced as potential options, but I think that I probably haven't gone much lower than Etienne or Lawrence on that roster. And it really comes down to, do you think they're going to beat the Buffalo Bills this week? And when we look at quarterback in general, to open it up to a bigger picture, the reason I wanted to talk about that game was you have two quarterbacks, I think, that are viable. And it depends on how people feel the contest, or not the contest, but the Super Bowl run for these teams could potentially evolve. Because I feel like you're kind of between those two, Drake May and Brock Purdy, as the strong candidates, along with Matthew Stafford. And that means that...
Shawn, are we willing to play Brock Bowers even though he's in IR and even though the Raiders are not in the postseason? But there's never a bad time to play Brock Bowers.
Shawn, I thought it was just default that our teams on the FFPC had to have Brock Bowers in them. But in terms of the quarterback, could be quite flat. In previous years, we've seen Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, maybe a Lamar Jackson, really like rule how people are feeling about the quarterback position. And then if you took anyone outside of those three, you were very contrarian. I think this year it could be very, very flat, maybe outside of if people do lean still to Josh Allen. I think the one that becomes very intriguing is Drake May, who you mentioned a moment ago, obviously with the Patriots. And the other thing just on Jacksonville I was going to mention, they lose in week 2 to Cincinnati. Since that then, as we moved through the season, they lost to the Seahawks and the Rams back-to-back. And then they lost to Houston 36-29 in the middle of the season. But they're losing to true Super Bowl or playoff caliber teams outside of that week 2 loss, and then they've won all other games. So really have had a strong run here, and I have been extremely impressed with the development of Trevor Lawrence, particularly in the second half of the season, and how they have started to move forward. So taking them as a real threat here in the conference. But on the Patriots side, when you're facing off here against the Chargers, I do think Drake May is a very interesting option at quarterback. The other thing that the Patriots have done over the last couple of weeks is, I think Ramondre Stevenson is kind of, I can't say the fountain of youth, but he has definitely started to play like we hoped he would have played 2 or 3 seasons ago, Shawn, with some of the play over the last couple of weeks. But they've Travion Henderson, who obviously has had big scoring games, got in the end zone again this week. Stephon Diggs obviously has some name popularity over the years that comes into play, but I think Drake May becomes very interesting as your quarterback if you expect them, which I do, to advance beyond the Chargers this week. And then the Chargers become another team of that potential fade category. Is there any names on the Chargers this time last year I believe it was the wildcard round, Chargers Texans, Lad McConkey went pretty wild in that one, but in terms of Patriots, Chargers, how do you feel that's going? And then what players are intriguing to you across the board on those?
Yeah, this Patriots team is so difficult to evaluate because their schedule has been unfathomably easy, right? We tend to think about schedule in the NFL as, the very toughest schedules are going to be pretty hard because you can get a cluster of games. If you have a first place schedule and you hit one of these divisions that is good, then your schedule can be tough, right? And the flip side can also be the case on the easy end. And yet what the Patriots have done this season, where their opponents are just entirely lacking. They have those 2 games against the Bills, and that's basically it, right? I think it's hard to know where they really are because they have done the thing that you want to see in the last couple of weeks, where they're hammering the bad teams. And yet they lost to the Bills a few weeks ago. We know the Bills are not particularly good this season. They had a long stretch of games before that where they were not crushing bad teams. And it puts us into this category where, how do we evaluate what Drake May has done, a player who has thrown more perfect passes than maybe any quarterback in any individual season in NFL history, but still is being babied a bit by the team, still takes sacks. You have a defense that has been fine against teams that are bad, but doesn't rush the passer particularly well. So we have some concerns about just how good the Patriots are once they face good teams. It's a completely different thing to play playoff teams than the teams that they have faced all season. And then you go and look at what the Chargers have done to opposing passing offenses, and they're difficult to get through, right? They don't allow a lot of yards after the catch. They don't allow a lot of separation. They're able to create pressure without blitzing. The Chargers then are even better as a rush defense. And so you don't necessarily have an easy place to go if you say, okay, well, we're actually going to take the Patriots in a loss, but a loss where we want to have a Ramondre Stevenson or we want to have a Travion Henderson. The Chargers, I think, are interesting in that this game is a lot more like the Packers-Bears game than I think most people are going to give it credit for, in that you have a Chargers team with injured players. You have a Chargers team that rested their guys in week 18. And yet we're still very competitive against the Denver Broncos, who are playing for real because they're trying to make sure that they get that number 1 seed and the bye. On the Chargers side, you have Justin Herbert. On the Chargers side, you have Jim Harbaugh. You have a better defense quietly than what the Packers have. And the Patriots are probably very similar to the Bears. Now, the Bears, we know, have questions because of the point differential that they had through most of the season, because of some of these late losses, because they're early in the development arc of the head coach, of the QB, all of those types of things. If you flip those two teams and put the Bears in the Patriots schedule and the Patriots in the Bears schedule, it would be very easy to see them not looking like each other, because the two teams themselves have very different personalities, especially at the QB position where the QBs are different. And yet this idea that both teams could outperform if you switched where they played. And yet you might have the questions with the Patriots. Well, they won all of these games, but did they destroy their opponents? No, they got a little bit lucky. On the Bears side, if they had faced the Patriots schedule and they were 14-3, you'd be like, yeah, but they didn't play anybody. And so I was just going back
through the schedule, Shawn. The Patriots have not beaten any team that have made it to the playoffs since they beat the Bills in week 5. So kind of when you talk about the schedule they've had, like the Buccaneers were looking like a playoff team, but they are no, like at the time they beat them, it felt like the Bucs were a playoff team, but obviously they aren't at this point.
It was astonishing when I did the team rankings. Now, this was even a month and a half ago, basically, at this point. But since then, they have barely beaten the Bengals. They hammered the Giants at home. They lost to the Bills at home. They have the win against the Ravens. That game is a little bit more inscrutable. The Ravens probably a bad team, but I mean, the Ravens have been all over the place. And then they had the 2 hammer victories against the Jets and the Dolphins. And the Jets and the Dolphins are probably the 2 teams that are tanking harder than any other teams.
The Jets are tanking? All as I could think of watching that game, Shawn, on Sunday was just Shawn saying the Jets are not a real NFL team. They certainly weren't this week.
And again, that doesn't mean that the Patriots aren't good, right? It doesn't mean that Drake May hasn't had a season. Like, if you asked me to pick MVP between Drake May and Matthew Stafford, I would say it's Drake May, hands down, no question. Like, have you watched the passes that Drake May has thrown? But it is going to be a problem when you go into the playoffs and you face this elite Chargers defense and you don't have guys who can get open in your receiving core. It's going to put even more pressure on Drake May. And then you look at the Chargers and what is the big weakness? It's like their offensive line completely and totally eviscerated by injuries. And as a result, Justin Herbert is under pressure from the snap, from the first play of the game to the last play of the game. He's taking a bunch of sacks. He's having to throw a bunch of passes away because you're trying to avoid sacks. That short circuits a ton of drives and makes the Chargers an offense that is really pretty easy to handle and can create mistakes for their own side because of all that pressure, even though you have Amari Hampton, even though you have a deep receiving core that features Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston and the invisible Lad McConkey, that'll be one of the great stories of the 2025/26 postseason, right? If you had Lad McConkey come out of nowhere and kind of be the guy again. After,
what are you gonna? Is he gonna get like the nickname like Mr. Wildcard Weekend or something if he does that?
That's probably not exactly the tag that you're going for, but it wouldn't be the end of the world if you're playing him in this contest. When you think about the non-touchdown that Trey Harris had, but the incredible body control on that, probably the best toe drag that we've seen on a non-catch this season. You think about these weapons the Chargers have. You think about the QB who's battle tested, although still kind of in that kind of poor man's Josh Allen category where you've got to prove it late in the season if you want to be considered in that kind of Hall of Fame-ish type of category. Not right now, but if Justin Herbert is good for another decade, that still only matters if he can win some of these games like this, right? You're going to have a matchup of two of the most macho coaches in the NFL. This is going to be a great game, or at least it has the potential to be a great game. And I think that either of these teams are interesting soft fades and even full fades. One of the teams is going to be out. And I don't think that it's as clear that that team will be the Patriots as the records and the trajectories of the two teams would indicate.
When we look then, obviously, at the 1 seed, and then we'll kind of go through how we think it's all going to play out. We've talked a lot about Denver this season. You know, we like RJ Harvey a lot. We like Bo Nix a lot. In terms of Denver, they have good victories this season over Houston, for example, who, if we project how we think that these matchups will go, potentially Houston going to them in the next round, but they have also lost at home to the Jacksonville Jaguars, which could end up being a rematch at some point, as we work our way through the bracket. Denver, Shawn, again, a little bit like New England, a little bit like I feel about the Bears in terms of how, their season has gone and how their record looks. Now, they have beaten some more competitive teams than the Patriots, but do you believe in Denver? And you think Denver believes in themselves here as they head towards the playoffs as the 1 seed with the bye?
Yeah, I think that the Broncos believe in themselves. The Broncos, one of these teams that is going to be, pretty feisty in terms of the overall personality. You've got that at the head coaching level with Sean Payton. You've got that at the QB position. Certainly, they have a ferocious pass rush. They have lots of talent in the secondary. If you do get open, they're just going to tackle you and commit pass interference. You're never going to have the good feeling of completing passes against the Broncos because they just don't allow that to happen, right? If you're open, they're just going to wrestle you to the ground. Any team going into Denver is going to have a tough matchup because of how good the Broncos are across the board and how difficult it is to play there in the mile-high conditions, and yet the inability of the Broncos to ever really get their offense humming all season. I mean, this is another game where Bo Nix was 14 for 23 for 140 yards against a Chargers team that's basically like, just get this game over.
This game was terrible, Shawn. The less said about it, the better.
I mean, we're to the point where they're pushing a rookie in Pat Bryant who's had injury problems and hasn't really done anything this year as the guy that they want to be the wide receiver 1. That's not a good point to be offensively. You think about where they were running the ball this week, Jaleel McLaughlin, who weirdly it puts up good peripherals for the Broncos, and yet Sean Payton never really wants to go with him. Now we have a lot of RJ Harvey. We like Harvey. He has been fantastic about getting in the end zone. He can catch the ball. He's a big play threat. He would seemingly have all of the parts that you would want from a guy in this type of contest if you don't think the quarterback can put up the numbers that you need. And yet, man, Harvey looked awful in this game as well. It was so depressing to head into the important part of the season with two guys that we really like in Nix and Harvey having some of the worst games that they have ever put up there. And these are not guys who have immaculate backgrounds where you're like, oh, well, they haven't had bad games before. I mean, they've had some bad games, right? And for this to be worse than that, it's just not the way that you want to go into the playoffs. They're going to have the bye. They're a very well-rounded team. They're a dominant team. But if you don't have more offensive explosiveness than they have, you can lose to anybody who is in this playoff group. When they go out there and play the Texans or the Chargers, when they eventually meet the Jacksonville Jaguars, you're certainly not going into those games thinking, oh, I mean, the Broncos are overwhelming favorites. You're more thinking these are coin flip games.
When we look at it, maybe they just thought this week, Shawn, they were facing Trey Lance, who, has got a chance to start in the NFL in this game. He goes 20 of 44 with an interception. Not great. It felt like the Broncos thought this game was going to be very easy. Bo Nix takes 4 sacks in it. You mentioned RJ Harvey, 15 carries for 28 yards. There was a lot of stuff left to be desired, but they do win. They do get the bye, so they get the reward off of that. When we look down at the bracket itself, Shawn, so people can kind of try and make some decisions, I think it's good to talk through the games and the range of outcomes like we have there to give that perspective to start it off. But now you set the Patriots one up to be a potential upset by the way we talked through that one. I don't know if that was the intention, but hit me with your 3 winners here in the AFC.
Colm, I'm going with Chargers, Jaguars, Texans.
Chargers, Jaguars, Texans. So we have an upset coming. Shawn, the 2 7th seeds are going to upset the number 2 seeds this week. If we're correct there, that will be pretty bold picks across the board. So we are going to see in your version of things, that would mean that the Chargers would go to face Denver in the next round, and would also mean that we get the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Houston Texans in a divisional rematch. That game would obviously take place in Jacksonville based on the seeding at the moment. Mines would have the Patriots hosting the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Houston Texans going to Denver in that scenario. Who's advancing here, Shawn, from the AFC side? How far are the Chargers going? I like the bold prediction, but with my Packers bold prediction, I kind of only had the heart to go to the next matchup. Are they just winning? Are they one and done here?
Yes, but again, it's going to be close. I think that you could definitely pick the Chargers through a couple of matchups. It's interesting, I think, in that if the Patriots win and the Jaguars go to the Patriots, I think that's an easier game than having to play at home against the Texans. It depends a lot on what you would rather face. Do you want to face the quarterback who has had the best season in the NFL and looks like he could be the next guy, right? The next Patrick Mahomes, the next player who rips off a string of 4, 5, 6 Super Bowls in 8 to 10 years? Or do you want to face the NFL's arguably best defense? Do you want to be in one of these games that will be low scoring, that could come down to the end? We know that the Jaguars had this game against the Texans not that long ago where they controlled the game and then allowed a really bad Texans offense to sneak it out at the end. Colm, that game featuring 26 fourth quarter points by the Houston Texans and 1 Davis Mills. Do you think the Jaguars are like, well, it's not Davis Mills this time, so we're not that worried about what is going to happen? Again, one of the things you see when you work through the AFC side is a lot of balance.
And just in that game, Shawn, you mentioned the Davis Mills. They were in complete control of that game. It's 29-10 entering the fourth quarter, where the Houston Texans put up 26 points to 0 to get the 36-9 win. So that one was one I think they will regret, and maybe they'll have to switch Davis Mills in as this game works its way towards the fourth quarter. In your prediction?
Yeah, and it's interesting here. One of the things I encourage people to look out for, Ben and I on Stealing Bananas will probably do the sort of head coaching draft we've been talking about for a long time. You look at the teams that I have in the NFC semifinals, and you see the 4 coaches there that tend to show up on everybody's list, right? You have the Seahawks, the Bears, the Rams, the 49ers, those sort of the quartet of young guns. The AFC side, we would have an interesting mix of head coaches where Liam Cohen with the Jaguars would be kind of the 5th guy from that group. And then you have the 2 sort of grizzled, macho, successful, like we're going to somehow win with force of personality, but not just force of personality, right? You think about Sean Payton and Jim Harbaugh, and what they really brought to those 2 organizations is professionalism and an attention to detail that results in the team simply being good at basically everything, not beating themselves, competing extremely hard. That portion of it, and how important that is compared to the tactical savvy of what we might call the young guns. That is an interesting storyline through the playoffs. And then certainly with Mike Vrabel, his team not in the semifinals for me, but a guy who obviously has brought professionalism and competitiveness to the Patriots. You have with the Houston Texans a situation here where their head coach is probably the poster boy at this point for just these ravenous defenses and the ability to impose your will at a level that's not just, again, okay, we're going to stop you, but it's, oh, we're going to humiliate you type of approach. The defensive side can sometimes get a little bit less coverage. I think when we're talking about Houston and you're coming off of the situation they had last year where you have quite a bit of dirty play and the need to corral some of those things, then you don't have DeMeco Ryans get quite the same level of positive coverage. He doesn't get quite the same discussion of being a genius in the way that you get with a Mike McDonald. And partly that's because the Seahawks have been able to balance their defense with an offense that scores a lot of points, even if a lot of those points actually come directly from the defense. It's hard to fathom in some ways that with this good of a defense that the Texans don't have that kind of counterattack ability or the points flowing off of what the defense is able to do in the way that the Seahawks have there in Seattle. But DeMeco Ryans, and especially when you consider the 0-3 start, I mean, I think that he should probably be it's going to be Mike McDonald, and it has to be Mike McDonald. He should finish second in the NFL Coach of the Year voting this season. His work and what the Texans have done has been that good. It's not surprising that all of these teams who are in the mix down the stretch would have coaches who are in that discussion. You know, would you want them to be the guy leading your franchise? But certainly this year, Colm, it feels more like that maybe than it has been in the past. Or maybe just there's a little bit more attention on it because we have a lot of young coaches having success. You love the fact that teams like the Broncos and the Chargers can, and then potentially the New England Patriots, can offer a different path there as well. There's not only one way, and thankfully, there isn't only one way to be an elite head coach at the NFL level.
I think no matter what, like people talk about like the script writers coming up with, a scenario for the season. But I do think on the AFC side and essentially on the NFC side, when you look through, no matter who's advancing or which teams are facing off or which teams make it to the Super Bowl, it does feel like, unless it's the Eagles, like I mentioned in the first show, you kind of have a new pitcher coming in there. Like it's either Josh Allen finally getting there or it's Drake May as the new, superstar of the NFL, or Denver make it there with Bo Nix. Jacksonville with the young head coach coming in his first year. You have the veteran and Aaron Rodgers if they happen to go in. Like there's all these, like it feels like there's a lot of fun to be had no matter what way these playoffs go over the next couple of weeks. But when we look through all those teams, Shawn, who is making it to the Super Bowl here out of this AFC? Because I do feel like when we're talking through it, like the NFC, there's a lot of different directions that these matchups could go. And I don't think that Denver being the 1 seed is as impactful maybe as Seattle being the 1 seed in the NFC, where I do think that's going to be a tougher maybe that's just that Jacksonville have kind of shown that they could go there and win a couple of weeks back. Who's getting out of the AFC here?
Yeah, I think it's going to be the Jaguars. And then I like the Jaguars over the Seahawks in the Super Bowl.
And does that lead you then, the reason I'm setting this up, does that lead you to Trevor Lawrence rosters?
I think so. Travis Etienne, a lot of fun. We've talked about some ways in which you look at that first round game and you tend to think about, okay, well, running backs in a victory, maybe receivers because of game script in a shootout and a loss. But because of the defensive outlooks and the way that both of those teams play, that either James Cook or Travis Etienne in a loss could be the way to play the first round. Etienne breaks the big plays, but he has not been the back as of late who is hot. And I think that probably does matter at least a little bit. Now, the flip side of it is that you probably can get him very low rostered if that's the way that you want to go. But you think about the last week where Bashal Tutin is back, scores a touchdown, those types of things. I don't think that Tutin is probably ready to play a huge role in the Patriots in the playoffs. I hope that I am wrong. We obviously have a lot of Tutin in Dynasty. And yet you look at Lawrence and you look at his hybrid abilities right now, and you think about who is the quarterback in the entire NFL who's showing the most competitiveness. Now, that's a little bit of a false discussion in some ways because we know almost all of these guys are competing really, really hard. But Lawrence's hybrid abilities, his feistiness, what Liam Cohen has given him offensively, where now there are a lot of answers to the questions that are being asked. He can beat you through the air. He can beat you on the ground. You have the well above average defense to complement. The best way to be able to survive these tournaments from a reality perspective is the same way that you would want to do it as you're trying to open it up for yourself in fantasy, where you need to have as many options, as many pathways as possible. The Jaguars on the AFC side are the team that has created the most possible paths. Doesn't mean that they will win, obviously. I think that almost all of these games are very, very even. They could easily lose to those Buffalo Bills in the very first round. And yet they also are the team, I think, that has the most answers overall. You certainly couldn't look at the Broncos and say that their offense has all the answers when you watch them play over the last month. A couple of weeks ago, it looked like maybe Denver was getting there and then taking some big steps back. Once the Jags too get in that Super Bowl against the Seahawks, you know, throw almost everything out the window. But the Jaguars and Trevor Lawrence, as many points as the Seahawks have scored, right? So much of it is based on the defense shutting everything down, overwhelming the opponent, and then almost through attrition, you get these scores for the Seahawks. You get the big plays. We know they do have big play options in JSN and Kenneth Walker. And yet Jacksonville just has more ways that they can beat you. Will their defense be able to do to the Jaguars what it just did to the 49ers? I certainly wouldn't suggest that they won't, right? But also, unlike the 49ers, if you don't start to bury the Jaguars, their defense is going to give you a lot more trouble than San Francisco did. This is maybe the most excited that I've been for the playoffs in a long time. And to separate that from the Chiefs situation as a Chiefs fan, but it does open up so many fun things. And we have so many even teams, even on the AFC side, those Steelers. Colm, this is going to be so much fun. When you're looking at a few of these teams like the Texans, like the Broncos, teams that we do think will get a little bit deeper in, how are you playing them if you assume that they're both playing 2+ games?
The challenging thing with all of these, because as we've hinted at, it's quite even and there's small differences that could like decide these matchups. It starts to get to outside of who you're picking kind of to be the quarterback, if you're going with the Trevor Lawrence, it's like picking on the other side as to just who you think can win those multiple matchups. I think that if we get to a situation like I said that I think the New England Patriots are going to win, that would lead them then to facing off with the Jacksonville Jaguars in New England. And I do think that the Jaguars are good enough to go in there and win. So I can still fall into your advancing of the Jaguars to that particular point. And I do think it's going to be a really tough matchup for Denver versus Houston. The one thing with Houston that we touched about when we talked about the Patriot or the Pittsburgh game is sometimes they don't put up enough points. And I think Denver probably would have enough to see them off, which gets you back to that rematch of the Jacksonville versus Denver contest in Denver. And it's a case then, can Jacksonville do it for a second time? And they won't have that thing of the noise is going to be really loud, so maybe we'll panic because they played in that extreme noise already just a couple of weeks ago and came away with the win. So I'm on board with Jacksonville advancing through. But when you ask about like Houston, for example, we think they're going to go multiple games. I do think there's no point in like really overthinking it to a massive extent. You probably are going to want to go with Nico Collins in that situation. You could go with the defense. Like I could also see a situation where, you know, Houston's defense like overpowers Pittsburgh considerably, and it could be pick six. It could be defensive scoring, a fumble, recovery for a touchdown, and maybe it becomes a situation where Houston's defense is the highest scorer on it. I would prefer not to be taking them through though to the next round. So I think I would probably stick to Nico Collins in that situation, because you can drop down to a Jaden Higgins, but I also think that you're probably getting a little bit, as I like to say on shows like this, a little bit too cute then at that particular point. Shawn may want to lean in that direction. The one that I was going to ask you about is when you look to Los Angeles, if you think that they're going to advance, who were some of the names? Like I was thinking of, like, if I think the Patriots are going to beat them, maybe they become a fade or a soft fade for me in that situation. Whereas if you think they're going to win, then you're likely going to want to take one of those players through with you to the next round. I did mention Buffalo. I do think that in that particular case, it does have to be James Cook if you think it's going to be a losing effort to the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then with Pittsburgh, the other player that could be factored in that hasn't played over the last couple of weeks would be DK Metcalf, but I would lean to one of the running backs if you're factoring in those names, if you're not going kicker or defense with those losing teams. Denver, Shawn, I think it's pretty straight up. If you don't think that they're advancing through to the Super Bowl, you're probably wanting to go with RJ Harvey. And I do think that RJ Harvey's performance this week may lower that ownership a slight bit, so that might be beneficial as well. But on the Chargers, with them advancing, even with the offensive line, are you looking towards an Omari Hampton, or who do you think is going to be able to pull them over the line against New England? I don't see that upset happening.
You don't like it. You don't like it as similar to Packers Bears.
No, I think that New England have played some bad teams, but they've they've beat the doors out. Like they've absolutely trashed them. Like I don't think they're going to just face off against the Rams and Drake May is going to forget how to throw the ball. And that's where I would still be, like, with Buffalo. They could, all the stuff that's in the favor of the Jaguars, I think sometimes like Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes could trump that. And I think in this situation, like Drake, I think there's a chance in like 4 weeks' time we're just like, yeah, Drake May. Like, he made picturesque throws throughout the season, but now he's the Super Bowl MVP. Like, I think he could just be that good.
I think you certainly want to consider Chargers kicker in a loss. The tough
Speaking of kickers, Shawn, sorry to interrupt you. Cam Little, sorry. What is that guy's leg made of? Like, is there a chance that the Jaguars just win the Super Bowl and you just like go with a kicker and get double points in the Super Bowl for some 70-yard field goals? They're just like, the ball is anywhere on the field and it's fourth down, we're just going to kick a field goal and he's just going to... Like, he's hitting these 65-yard field goals like he's, I don't know, tying his laces.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun. You could certainly go with him. But the tricky part here is that on the AFC side, we don't actually have a lot of dynamic options. And I think that does make it more compelling to simply say, okay, well, even if the Patriots are a pretty savvy upset pick, they're also a team that has guys you can play, and that we want to maximize the strength of our roster simply by having as many good scorers out there. And that gives you flexibility for a lot of different types of outcomes. One of the things that's unfortunate is that probably the two most compelling teams on the AFC side are the Jaguars and the Bills, and they play each other in the first round. So you're going to lose either Trevor Lawrence or Josh Allen just right off the bat. But if it's Josh Allen, then you have this upset through, and you're able to play Josh Allen at much lower rostership than we would ever have had before. So those things are compelling, right? It's not really think so much about what are the best upsets, but what are the ways to simply maximize scoring by picking teams through who do have interesting offensive players. We talked a bit about the Texans. I think Dalton Schultz is probably the way to play that, especially if you're Colm Kelly and you're saying, okay, the Packers are going to upset the Bears, and Colston Loveland. I mean, Colston Loveland in a loss is still very compelling, but you might not be completely locked into Loveland if you have the Bears as first round losers.
And I will say, like, we sometimes like kind of turn our nose down at Schultz, but over the last like 3 or 4 weeks, he has had some incredible catches.
Well, he's been on fire over the second half of the season.
He had a 32-yard reception this week. Like he has made some fantastic plays. And when we look at, it's not happening for Nico Collins. Like you mentioned, I still would lean Collins, but if you are thinking, tight end and we're pivoting off Loveland, Schultz would be interesting. But he has been playing really well.
Yes, and Nico Collins has been playing extremely poorly. Again, the point there, though, would be that you can get Collins at levels that you wouldn't be able to get previously. And if you think that basically the entire 2025 season has been a fluke, and Nico Collins is one of the 6 or 7 best receivers in the NFL, and that the Texans are going to move through these playoffs, then, I mean, he becomes a very, very fun pick. Man, the hardest thing for me is just I'm about as devastated as you can be from an offensive performance that was meaningless to any of our teams, because week 18 is not a real week. But that Broncos performance from Nix and Harvey just shatters all of my dreams about how you would play the Broncos through the postseason.
Maybe that's their plan, though. They wanted to like make people think that they're just not good. A bit like the Packers done it for 4 weeks. The Bears or the Broncos just did it for the last week. But yeah, again, we could be looking in a couple of weeks like that was an opportunity. I think that when we talk through the quarterbacks that you would play, Nix isn't really on the list of the guys that I'm targeting in this contest, because I think you can get more from Harvey over the games than you will from him, just in terms of building out the rest of your roster. And I do like May, I do like Trevor Lawrence, and I prefer them based on building out these teams over the options in the NFC. So it does become challenging, but it's weird to have the 1 seed and just be like, don't want any of those guys. So maybe we need to just factor the recency bias of that one contest out of our heads, but we will see how it plays out. The wildcard weekend, obviously coming up this weekend. Shawn, that happens every year, and I know it's because, like, I would have to assume it's just because the Packers are a popular team, but they tend to, at least it's on the Saturday and it's overnight. Why the Packers are always like at 1 a.m., 1:30 my time when it comes to the playoffs. It's never like, let's give him the 9:30 slot in Ireland. Like, they don't consider me at all when they're setting up these games. Why is that?
Well, Colm, I was going to ask you, like, how much stock you have in the Packers. Like, are you a part owner of this team? Do we need to be considering
I'm not a part
your like insider bias as we work through these? I mean, is this a Tom Brady type of effect where you are part owner, part
I have inside
management, and yet like you're still going in and getting all the answer is no.
The answer is no. But the other thing I will say is I tend to, and I think people might agree, I tend to stay pretty level in terms of like they're not the best thing. I'm not going only for the Packers, but I do think the Packers are better than the Bears, and I think we'll see that this week. I set it up so modestly before we kicked it off, but we are going to see those games over the course of this weekend. 6 games that I think will be tremendous, and I think the games will only get better from this point out. I don't like, people might look at the Panthers and be like, well, you know, the Panthers or the Steelers, or maybe even people feel that way about the Packers or the Chargers that aren't that, but I think they're all worthy of being in here for these matchups, and we're going to have a great run of weekends here through to the Super Bowl. So hopefully people are looking forward to the playoffs, whether your teams are in or not, but you can jump into the playoff challenge and get involved over at myffpc.com to have some action on the sidelines as we get ready for, which I think, Shawn, could be one of the best playoff slates here that we've had in a long time. So we are going to leave it there. We did our NFC show, as I mentioned earlier in the week. We talked through some of those angles. So head on back and listen to that if you haven't already. Of course, if you are subscribed, you get all the shows once they are available as well. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on socials at Overtime Ireland. Of course, check Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.